To sum up for this week, I'd just like to add a few thoughts about travel writing and the publication of travel logs in early modern Europe. Over the next few weeks, several of our sources will be from travel journals that were published by people who had visited Italy during our period. We are reading sources by travelers, essentially who come from the British Isles, primarily. And we're reading these primarily because they were eyewitness accounts written in English, and there aren't many easily accessible, digitized primary sources written in English about Tuscany for our period. The end of the 16th century witnessed a greater deal of cultural exchange between Italy and England than ever before. This was something that was rather problematic for contemporary observers. You see, England had recently split from the Catholic Church under Henry VIII and had gone through successive political and religious revolutions in which the country switched from Catholicism to a form of Protestantism, back to Catholicism under Mary, and then definitively back to Protestantism under Elizabeth I, with the establishment of what would become the Anglican Church of England, with the sovereign, so the king or the queen, as the head of the church. In the meanwhile, Italy, being home to the church and the Pope, who by now many Protestants saw as the Antichrist, Italy became synonymous with superstition and sin in the minds of upright English Protestants, not to mention Puritans. So this meant that those who, like Robert Darlington, ventured to Italy in the late 16th century were sometimes seen by these religious-minded observers as tainted by popery when they returned. Popery is a sort of byword for anything that smacks of Catholicism. So whether it's corrupt priests or the Pope himself, any of the trappings of Catholicism. So this is late 16th century, heading into the 17th century, and ironically, just as more and more English people traveled to Italy, or not ironically, but the fashions, Italian fashions in theater and in dress, became ever more popular in England, and also more decried by puritanical observers. For a time, the sort of frilly ruffs, the neck ruffs, and even the color yellow worn by Elizabethans and early Stuarts were decried as profane, as scandalously Italianate. So people worried that these imported fashions were threatening not only the local English production of cloth, textiles, clothing, but Englishness itself. If you remember that people at the time believed that clothes really did make the man, in the sense that by putting on any sort of garb, whether it be in the clothing of a penitent monk or that bright yellow imported from the continent in the form of silk stockings, for example, from France, you could really risk becoming part of that foreign culture, of changing who you are fundamentally. So it's almost like the clothes penetrate the body. The body is seen as kind of being culturally porous. Now, Italian fashions, as well as learning the language, this was becoming ever more popular in London itself, where you have an expatriate community of Italians, people like John Florio, seen here, who is of Italian-English descent. His father moves to London, and Florio himself becomes a celebrated teacher of Italian, publishes several dictionaries and also a translation of Montaigne's essays. So at the same time that you have this kind of budding interest in Italian fashions and courtly culture, if we remember also the effect of Castiglione. Um, this the fascination with these foreign cultural influences was seen also as being very threatening by some, because it was seen as having the power to transform who you were fundamentally, both ethnically and culturally as English, or also religiously. So it could transform you from being a good, upstanding Protestant Englishman into a sort of morally decrepit, effeminized Italian Catholic, pseudo-Catholic man. There was a saying at the time, which is "Inglese italianato è un diavolo incarnato," which means kind of literally the Italianate Englishman is the devil incarnate. So that gives you a sense of the contemporary fears that surrounded this kind of cross-cultural transmission that was becoming more and more prevalent in England. But at the same time, other intellectuals and prominent men, such as the scientist and philosopher Sir Francis Bacon, urged that travel, and even travel to Italy, was crucial to expand the mind and to finesse one's education. So he even publishes, in the form of his essays, some tips about traveling, a sort of guide for travelers, telling them what they should be looking for when going to foreign countries, what kind of sights to admire and to make notes about. It's a sort of early 17th century Lonely Planet, if you will, an instructional manual for writing a good travel journal. So simultaneously, in the early 17th century, we also see the beginnings of what would later become known as the Grand Tour. This generally took the form of a young man from a noble family or from a wealthy family, let's say, that would be sent out on a long voyage with his tutor. They would generally, if they were leaving from England, they might travel first overland through France, then down to Italy and back again, or they might take ship directly from Dover to perhaps, Leghorn, or eventually traveling on to Rome, that sort of thing. So accompanied by his tutor, the boy would be instructed in the best way to write a travel journal, which was an exercise designed to sharpen his powers of observation. So the boy would have to recall in detail the churches and military fortifications and other interesting landmarks that he had seen. And this would also serve to prove to the boy's parents that they were getting their money's worth out of their tutor. The boy would also be required to write letters home in order to train him in the etiquette of letter writing, and the voyage as a whole would expand his experience of foreign nations, languages, and cultures, and act as a sort of finishing school, so that he would be prepared to sort of hobnob with elite society. So as the growth of northern trade in the Mediterranean means that there were more ships going from England to Italy, it also meant that more travelers, not just merchants, are going as well. These travelers would often follow Bacon's advice, dutifully noting down their observations of famous landmarks. And those who were interested in perfecting their Italian would travel to Tuscany, in particular Siena and Florence, as the region already had a reputation for having the purest form of the Italian language. In Tuscany, they would also marvel at churches and Roman ruins before going on to generally Venice or Rome. Once they returned to England, they would often publish their travel logs with the idea of making a sort of profit from their voyage. Travel diaries had long been a very popular source of information about the outside world for English readers. Since the advent of the printing press, they had gained an ever wider readership. In addition to these travel logs, captivity narratives were also very popular. These captivity narratives were written by men, primarily sailors, who were captured by foreign forces, usually Ottomans or North Africans, and held by them as slaves. Sometimes they would work rowing the oars on galley ships, or in other cases, they would work in the homes or businesses of private individuals. In order to free these men who were put into servitude, collections were often taken up by their relatives or the wives, and they would ask for donations from their churches, or they would petition the English Parliament in order to raise enough money to buy their loved ones' freedom. In some cases, captives would buy their own way out of captivity. In other cases, they might convert to Islam as a means of facilitating their path to freedom. Some would even find the life of a slave or an indentured servant in foreign nations quite acceptable. They would assimilate with the local culture and choose to remain abroad. Others were capable of escaping alone or with the help of friends. In recent years, historians have written a great deal about Christian captives in the Mediterranean, and they've also done a good deal of work on the narrative accounts that these captives would write and publish once they returned home. It's important to remember that when we read these travelogues or surveys, as Robert Darlington called his synopsis of his experience in Tuscany, that the observers, the writers, often use highly subjective language to describe the people and cultures they encounter. This has come to be understood as a process of othering, of describing foreigners or foreign cultures as the other, like capital O. This other is observed by the writer and described in terms of that which the writer does not consider himself to be. Thus, when we read Englishmen's accounts of Ottomans or North Africans, they may write about them as barbarians or use other sensationalized language that leads to a sort of us versus them dichotomy, in which the observer, so the English, for example, writer, constructs a notion of his identity as English, what it means to be English, in terms of what he is not. So he is not, say, a popish, superstitious Italian Catholic. So as with all of our sources, we should always ask what the motives were of the person who was writing, and in what historical context they produced their work, in order to understand the document on its own terms. So have fun reading Darlington, and I hope we will have a lively and well-attended conversation about this week's sources on the discussion board.